Welcome, everybody, to the Why I Love America podcast. I'm Hayden. My brother, Jackson, is out of town, so he's not here with me today. But that's okay because we have an amazing guest that counts for two people. She does so much. Jen Brown, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah, we're excited to have you. This podcast wouldn't even exist without you. Why I Love America would not exist without you.
That's right.
You have done a lot. Now, for those who aren't familiar with you, before we get into today's subject, which is extremely important and needed today, who are you and how'd you get into doing all this?
Well, thank you, Hayden. So I grew up just here in Utah. I grew up in Woods Cross, and then I went to Weber State, and then I actually went to dental school in Omaha, Nebraska.
Really?
And I just thought that, you know what, I'll just go back home. My husband and I will, work a little bit as a dentist, and we'll have kids, and that will just be the
nice,
end of the story.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And it's really interesting because I actually remember the day that my path got unexpectedly changed.
Mm-hmm.
It was my 30th birthday. And I always go shopping for my birthday. So I was at the mall with my mom and my sister. And while I was there, I saw some posters that were quite inappropriate, which we've all seen at the mall. I had this feeling just come over me that I was to help protect the youth and to help do the best we can to prevent those things from being prevalent in society. And that feeling stayed with me for a couple of days. And I remember thinking, well, what in the world could I do to help with that? And I'm busy. By that point, I had probably three sons. But that feeling persisted. And I remember the first thing I did was I called the Davis County attorney and talked to him about what are the laws we have to protect children. And that started at 15 years ago. And from there, it was just community work, political work, working to protect the rising generation and working to protect our founding principles that America was founded on.
That's awesome. And what you ended up doing, I'll fill in a little bit of the gaps because I know you. You actually got, Utah is, I don't know if it's the only state, but one of the only state that kind of declares pornography a public health crisis, and that it is not good. It's the only legislation that really says like this is not good for
and it destabilizes society. Yes. So we were able to get that passed, and then we actually have had 11 states that have followed our example and that have passed it. And it's interesting because that was a resolution, so it's not a binding where it's forcing people to do things.
Anything. Yeah.
But having that resolution, it opened the door to do a lot of legislation that succeeded that are actually laws that put protections in place. So that resolution ended up being very important. And as I've done this so many years, you learn about kind of natural sequences and how one thing can often add to another, and that there's many things that are helpful, and you don't always go for the exact thing you want all at one time.
That's really wise. And I think that's one of the beauties of the way that we have our system set up is you have, the executive power, right? And everyone thinks that like the president, that if you want something changed, do it through the president, right?
Right.
But you're a perfect example of you went to the Davis County attorney first, then you move up to the state level, and you're like, okay, well, I'm not going to try to legislate something yet. I'm just going to get them to recognize that pornography is not good for society. And you just take that step-by-step approach, which I think it's built into the system for us to be able to do that.
Exactly. And I can't believe, if you start 15 years ago, how many pieces of legislation have been passed to protect the youth? So there's just much good that has come of it. And there's definitely a way to do things in a strategy, how you can be most effective.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's awesome. And today you brought this beautiful prop, the scales of justice.
The scales of justice.
And it has to do a little bit with what we just barely talked about, this idea of kind of it's a bottom-up government. That's the way it's supposed to work, right?
Absolutely.
But that might not be how it is working now or how it has in the past. Let's talk a little bit about the separations of power, the sort of things that allow us as people to actually affect difference in a big way like you have.
So I am excited to talk about some of these fundamental principles about America. So I taught a Patriot camp where I teach the youth about the Constitution. So I'm going to use some of those techniques because
well, it's going to help me because I'm not that smart. So visualization's good.
Exactly. I found that this worked really well. And so what I start with is I have this ball of clay right here.
Mm-hmm.
This represents power. So if you go back to England, who had all the power?
King George.
Absolutely. So the king had all the power. He could dictate whatever he wanted. He could throw people into prison if he wanted. He could kill people if he wanted.
Mm-hmm. He was above the law.
Exactly. There was no accountability for him. So the people obviously came to America. They came to the colonies, and they were still under that control of King George. So when we go back to that colonial time, we know the phrase taxation without representation, and people are thinking, oh yeah, well, that is important that we have representation, but most people don't really understand the level of tyranny they were living in. Think if you had to allow soldiers to come into your house, take the beds, they could kick you out of your own room. Think of how difficult that would be on a family. And that is what was happening, which is why that's one thing that they specifically put in the Bill of Rights.
Constitution. Mm-hmm.
So they were living under a difficult situation. And that's why this feeling started to emerge of, wait a minute, why do we have to keep putting up with this? So obviously this feeling of liberty started to really take root within the colonies. So, we know that Lexington and Concord took place, the Revolutionary War began, and miraculously the colonists were victorious. A lot of people don't realize, though, that after the Revolutionary War, America almost fell apart. We were this close to the country just not being able to make it because there was total chaos. And the states were acting in a lot of ways like independent little countries. So they were having, as you tried to go from one state to another, even at times, different currencies. They had different rules with commerce. There was absolutely no organizational structure. And we know that chaos does not allow liberty to flourish.
And we're talking, too, that this is up until the Civil War, really, that people were having their own currencies in their own cities and their own states. And there was huge issues with forging currency and stuff like that. And so up until the Civil, America didn't really cement itself as like a really good idea until after the Civil War. Right.
There was definitely just so many differences. And the mindset at that time was, well, I'm a Virginian. They didn't think of themselves as an American. But what happened was in 1787, representatives from each state got together and the Constitutional Convention took place. And so the Constitutional Convention was obviously in the making of the Constitution, the ratification, was certainly that started the path of America being able to work together, the states working together. But yes, there were a lot of differences even up until the Civil War. But the Constitutional Convention took place, and so many different ideas were being talked about. It's a miracle, and we don't say that lightly. It really literally was a miracle with so many different opinions and ideas that the Constitution and these principles were able to be put together and then ratified by 9 different states. So I want to just share a few principles about America that are unique to her. One is that America is the only country in the entire world that was founded on principles. And the principles that America was founded on are perfect. Now, the implementation of these principles has certainly not been perfect. And when we start back at when the Constitutional Convention was, this idea of universal human rights, we weren't even close to that being accepted by the ordinary person. And so we've certainly had a long road to take. Slavery was a world problem that was brought here by the English. And, this started the path, though, of human rights. And to say, it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter where you were born or how much money you have unalienable human rights that are given to you by God. And
there's 2 things I want to point out from what you're saying here. One is, when you kind of think of it, the founding fathers, when it came to human rights and slavery as well, they kind of followed the same path you did with the whole pornography thing, right? They set a resolution, a constitution that says, hey, or I guess the declaration would be kind of like the resolution almost. All men are created equal, and they're made, with inalienable rights. And so there's that. The second thing I want to point out, and this was actually pointed out to me by a friend of mine who is Iranian. It was funny because we were having a conversation about the founding of America, and he pointed out, he's like, America is the only country where being a patriot has nothing to do with the country. It has to do with the principles. It has nothing to do with the government.
Exactly.
Actually, most patriots have an issue with the government because the principles that are put into the Constitution say government has performed many evils throughout human history, so we're going to put some checks on it.
Exactly.
And that's what's amazing. That is absolutely unique.
Absolutely. And you made such a good point about the founders had to start this path, but overnight they couldn't change the entire, not just the states, but even the entire world. And this mindset had to just continue to be taught as, it doesn't matter what race you are, what your background is. You have inalienable rights, and you are entitled to the same protections as anybody else, even the richest people in the land. And another point on slavery that a lot of people don't know is that the Constitution was the first time slavery was actually successfully put in check, where it said the slave trade will end at this certain date. So it was absolutely essential for this path to be able to abolish this heinous
crime of humanity.
Yes, crime of humanity, where people were owning each other. And so America needs to be looked at in the proper light, that because of America, that is much, much less frequent than it was those couple years ago. And so another principle that I just wanted to mention is that the purpose of the Constitution and our government is to protect human rights. And that is also a new concept, because people, before the Constitution, the purpose of government was just they did what they want, and they're trying to amass power. So another unique thing about America is that the people are sovereign, and the purpose of the Constitution, our highest laws, are to protect our individual rights. So now I'm going to get back to this ball of clay that we
I've
talked
been waiting
about.
for this part.
So, if we go back to King George III, this is power, and he had all the power. So there were no checks and balances on him. So now we go to the founders, and they said, we cannot allow this to happen again, where power is just in one area. So the first division of power that the Constitution gives is between the states and the federal government. But most people, Hayden, skip over this first division. They go right to those 3 branches of government. This is a key point that I want the listeners to take away from today. The first division of power is called federalism, and it's between the state and the federal governments. And if you put that on there, you can see that this is balanced. That our framework of government, this, if we're following it, this is supposed to be completely balanced, that they're checking each other. But the federal government was never intended to have more power than the state governments. But right now, if we call this the federal government, this is what is happening, is that the federal government is seeking to amass. Yes, we're going to just... So over time, and it's happened over decades of time, little by little, the federal government just keeps
heavier and heavier,
grabbing power. And that is of great concern. And so it's something that the citizens need to be aware of so that we can start performing tasks as well as passing laws that help correct this balance.
Yeah. So this is, before we continue, this is a principle that exists in my military training. And what I mean is this: the separation of powers between the federal and the state government it's what we call decentralized command, right? And so in the military, you may get an order from the president of the United States, and his order is, I need you to do this. But you as a small unit leader, me as a team leader, right? I have 3 guys with me. I actually see the battlefield.
Oh, exactly.
The higher up doesn't see the battlefield, so he doesn't know all the little nuances, and so he can't effectively make decisions the same way I can as a small unit leader. And so me as a small unit leader, I actually have the ability to say, I know you told us to take this hill, but because of this, this, and this, because I see it on the battlefield, we're not going to do that. We need to go this way. We're still going to seize the objective, but we're going to decide how that objective is going to be seized. And that is the exact same thing that the state government is supposed to be doing. Our state government is much smaller and can see the individual person way better than this giant, federal government.
Absolutely. That is such a perfect analogy. So with the federal government, just like you were saying, Hayden, it was given certain responsibilities that are written in the Constitution. So the founder said, how do we prevent this power from conglomerating? And the solution was, we have to write in the Constitution exactly what authority the federal government has, so they know these are your responsibilities. Everything else goes to the states. So these are found in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Those are the enumerated powers. And I will just mention a couple of them because these are responsibilities that make sense, that all the states need to have a uniform way for these things to work. For example, one of them is the post office, that they were given the authority to make a post office for the whole country. Because think if you had in different states, a stamp was a different amount and you couldn't send letters across, you couldn't send mail. So that makes sense. Another one that you hit on is currency. We had to have the same currency. So that job was given to the federal government. Another one is patents. So that if somebody invented something and they wanted to have a patent, that needed to be good through all of the states. Because how could that really be reasonable from state to state, that those kinds of things would be different? So, and then like declaring war and overall a lot of military responsibility with that federal government. But what is not, if it's not mentioned in the Constitution, it goes to the states. So a few of the state responsibilities are, for example, education. Utah is supposed to be managing its own education system. Another one is healthcare, energy, transportation within the state, our roads and things like that.
Question. So why do presidents run on education and stuff like that? Like, that's why I don't understand. Because I remember, like presidential fitness programs and things like that. And also Common Core, I think Common Core has a federal
Oh, it
beginning,
does.
right? And so, like,
Right.
why is that happening?
Because that power has been usurped by the federal government. It's of great concern. The
Yeah.
federal government is not supposed to be any involved in education whatsoever. And I was just getting into politics and community work when Common Core was coming down saying, you know, the federal government's doing this program. Should Utah join into it? And I remember some of those conversations, and they were, the federal government doesn't have constitutional authority to be involved in education. But then I remember hearing other people say, what does it hurt? You know, it's just, I remember different you know, people within government saying it's 2 + 2 = 4. It's just basic educational principles. So what does that hurt? Well, let me tell you this, Hayden. Here we are. Do you realize what the states have done allowing the federal government to usurp this educational jurisdiction? Title IX was just finalized. Title IX was passed decades ago to help protect women in sports, that they would have equal opportunities. And, you know, and a part of that was that they'd have comparable facilities. They would have the ability to participate in sports. You know, obviously, girls would be competing against girls and boys would be competing against boys. They have said that actually sex is not going to mean males and females, is going to mean gender identity and sexual orientation. The implications on the states are huge.
Yeah, and because
They're huge.
Yeah. And just like we were pointing out with what you did with setting the resolution and then eventually turned into legislation, I guess that's kind of what happened. It's a double-edged sword. It works both ways, where the federal government, maybe technically speaking, and I don't know a ton about it. All of this was happening before I cared about any of this. So, but you know, they make a suggestion, hey, you should adopt this new thing. And then when we adopt that, then all of a sudden we're like, we look to our government overlords. What do you want us to do? And then eventually that just snowballs until we just give the reins over to them completely.
Exactly. And just the reason that happens is they don't just make a suggestion. They tie federal money to it.
Yes,
and so
it's a bribe. It's a giant bribe.
Exactly.
Give us power and we'll give you money.
The states have sold their souls to the federal government in a lot of different ways. Just last night, I was around many, many candidates that are running for office. I had this conversation with a member of the state school board. We were talking about Title IX, and I said to him, what a price the states have paid for not guarding jealously that constitutional line. It is going to be so much work to try to get back out. But I can tell you, there is a will that's building. And there's a louder and louder voice saying the Department of Education should be abolished at the federal level because there is not constitutional authority for it. Yeah. But a perfect example of, if we were still just managing our own education system, the youth in this state would be protected much better than they are right now. And some of the agendas coming in through the Federal Department of Education would not even be an issue for us.
Yeah, and the thing that I want to point out here, because this podcast isn't necessarily a political podcast, right?
Right.
But this goes over politics, because this is just talking about states' rights, federal rights.
Exactly.
And the thing that's a problem is that word states' rights got such a bad rap from the Civil War. You know what I mean?
Right.
Because it was used as a justification for a true evil, which is slavery.
Right.
But we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I think that's what has happened. And so I think this spans, because there have been both Republican and Democratic presidents who have usurped states' rights.
Absolutely.
In that sense.
This is both parties have done this over decades of time and just slowly kept eroding these constitutional protections that were put in place. And so we can see how important it is that the states guard these constitutional jurisdictions, and people need to know what the enumerated powers are. First of all, every single elected official should be able to say these enumerated powers just like that. And there's a lot of elected people that don't know the enumerated powers. So that is one of our missions, is to just teach what are these powers within the Constitution, because a citizen should be able to start hearing a conversation about maybe suggestions either the state has or the federal government has, and immediately what they should say to themselves. If government, so did we even give a government the authority in the first place? Which government? So then, is this a state jurisdiction, or is this a federal, or is this something that the federal government does have the authority to do? That should be happening in every citizen's mind daily as they're learning different things going on.
For sure. So we've divided power in the United States of America by federal and state jurisdictions.
Right.
But even within those federal and state jurisdictions, there are also other divisions of power, right?
Exactly. So this is what most citizens know. Then you've got the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branch. Okay. So this is the federal government, and it is broken into those three. But I won't be able
and this
to
is
do this,
executive president.
Right.
Congress is legislative, and then
the
Supreme Court.
Yep, Supreme Court is judicial. So I can't really do justice to this, because if I were doing it exactly as it would, we'd start by breaking up this power into 50 little balls and that represents the 50 American states.
Okay.
And then each one of those balls would then be divided into the three branches of government.
Oh, wow.
So you would actually, if we're doing this correctly, we would have 150 little balls over here. Okay, so if you imagine the 150 here and then our three bigger ones here.
Yeah.
Think of that fragmentation of power compared to, and let's go back to what King George had.
Which is just one ball.
One.
Yeah.
So think of the fragmentation of power.
Yeah.
So the genius of the Constitution is the fragmentation of power.
Decentralized command, yeah.
Yep. And so I've thought a lot about, why does the fragmentation of power matter so much? I've really, really pondered it a lot. And it comes down to those inalienable rights. History shows over and over and over again, as power amasses, the individual rights of people and their liberty, it goes down proportionately. It's without fail. And if you go back, you look at these different dictators, and as people are trying to gather power, the oppression of the people just absolutely is in accordance to how much power there is by those dictators.
And that's where that phrase, absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yes.
And that is true. And that is so beautiful. I'm learning here too. What about on the county level? Is there an executive?
Absolutely. So
does it break down into three?
Oh, for
all the
sure.
way down to the city level?
Absolutely.
That's
so
amazing,
if you want
actually.
Exactly. And that's part of it. I mean, you can keep going, because then within each state, you've got the counties. So that's it. And then within each of the counties, you break it down to the cities.
And you got mayors.
And so when we talk about jurisdiction, which is talked about a lot when you're making laws, that is constantly on people's minds. Is, the mayors will speak out and say, hey, that's our jurisdiction. We don't want the state telling us what to do. The mayor should have that ability to decide that. And so the division of power is, it just goes and goes and goes. It's like we said, it's truly a fragmentation of power. And I'm going to do this. I'm going to bring a big piece of glass when I'm talking about the Constitution. And then I'm going to, with a hammer, I'm going to break that, because think of just the shards and the pieces that are sent everywhere. That is what the genius of the Constitution is. And I'm so glad you mentioned that. It does not stop at the state level. Then it just goes down, down, down. And as we respect those divisions of power, that is going to give the people the greatest level of liberty. And liberty is everything. It's the essence of our existence. Every person, that is what's in their heart, is they desire individual liberty. And there's so many aspects of it. It's not only freedom of speech, freedom of religion, it's economic freedom to be able to decide what career choice am I going to go in, and that you're able to keep most of what the fruits of your labor are. That is economic freedom. And we know as government often becomes more towards a dictatorship, usually the people are very oppressed economically, and there's so much waste and fraud, and more is being taken from the people. Then, of course, we've got medical freedom that has, become a big issue, that people should be able to have, the ability to decide what they want to do to their own bodies. So there's so many areas of individual liberty, and it is the essence of our existence is to fight for this liberty. It speaks to every person, to their heart, that it's what they want, it's what they're craving. And as these liberties decrease, it's just a tragedy for the human family. And that's why it is so important that we guard these lines of power.
And I'll tell you, it's difficult, and I kind of, because this is me being totally transparent here, and I'm involved with this and all of this. I don't even know the name of my mayor. I'm sorry. You probably know the mayor. What's the name of the Sandy City mayor? Do you know?
Okay, I don't know Sandy, but I do know
you
Bountiful.
Know yours.
I do know mine.
You don't need to know Sandy.
Right.
That's why. But I don't know my own mayor. I don't know.
Right, maybe your city council, yes, your school board. That's another big one. And you don't have kids in school yet,
not yet.
So we're going to say
and
on
who
that
knows
one,
where my kids are going to go to school? I don't even know what the situation's going to be.
Well, and you know what? That a big part of when I teach about these principles is I talk about where you can have the biggest impact is where it's most local. So you can start at your city. But even on the state level, citizens would be surprised how much influence you can have on a state level. I mean, after I had that experience feeling that I was to help protect the youth, I went to my state senator. Well, he lived like 5 minutes away from me. And we were able to develop a relationship where we were, talking about these issues, our concerns. And I started working with him to pass legislation. And look at the impact that it's had on Utah. So a lot of people are focusing so much on the federal government. I really make the suggestion for people that step it back, and who represents you in your city, and who represents you on the state level. There is a lot of influence you can have where it's more local, and everything that's happening locally impacts the federal. If citizens are working with their local and their state representatives, it is more difficult for the federal government to amass power if there's good citizen involvement that are watching this and watching for that balance of power.
The reason why people are able to take something that's not theirs is because our eyes aren't on it in the first place.
Exactly.
Like thieves wait until you're asleep. Before they break into your house. They're not going to do it during the day when you're cognizant. So I think it's wise to think we need to open our eyes, and the federal government won't be doing what it's doing.
We wouldn't be in this situation where, I shouldn't put it all there, but where the federal government has a lot more power than it was supposed to have. If as citizens, we were truly watching and guarding that constitutional line. And so, there's a spirit of federalism sweeping the country. And there are a lot of citizens that are saying, wait a minute, we've got to step back here. And it's the states that are the ones that have to step up and regain that balance. But they can't, the state as a whole, it's got to be driven by the citizens. The citizens have got to say to their representatives, don't you dare let the federal government take any more of that jurisdiction. And what are we going to do to start helping correct this balance? And that is a priority. And what I like the line is, your job is to protect me and my family's individual liberty, and we're looking to you to protect our liberty. And our state representatives, they need to hear that from the citizens, and then they need to feel that they've got that support.
Responsibility
and then
support.
We're moving together to do it. And like I said, there's a spirit of federalism that is sweeping the country, and there is great reason to be very hopeful that just if we get off course a little bit in our organization of government, we have the ability to get back on course. So,
Yeah, and the more I'm thinking about it, throughout most of America's history, before the unprecedented communication technology that we have now, you probably didn't hear much from the president or about the president. Most of it was probably what your governor. That's probably about as high as it went, right?
Absolutely.
And I'm grateful for technology. I'm grateful that we can do that. But at the same time, I think that we are getting distracted by shiny things, the White House.
Yes.
And it's just like we shouldn't, who the president is, we focus so much on that.
Yep.
The only reason why that matters so much now is because we've given him so much power.
Exactly.
If he had the power that is actually in the Constitution, it really would be almost irrelevant to the everyday citizen who the president of the United States is.
Exactly, because we'd be managing our own education system. Like we said, we would be managing so many of the important parts of our day-to-day life was absolutely intended to be done by the states with no involvement from the federal government. And so if we really had that correct balance of power, you're right. Most of our day-to-day decisions and what impacts our family, everything would be happening on the state level, and we would be turning to our state representatives to make suggestions and to figure out all those details.
Yeah, and it really, I mean, I want to ask what your thoughts are on this, but to me, what it's going to take to be able to right the ship and get it right is for people to get into power that aren't going to do what the last person did. Because this is what happens.
Absolutely.
You have this pulling back and forth.
Yep.
Like, oh, they used the power incorrectly to put these in, so I'm going to use the power incorrectly to put this in. And what it's going to take is an adult to get in there and say, you know what? I'm going to stop what they did here, but I'm not going to counteract it inappropriately with my power. I'm just going to try to right this ship. But that's going to take a very mature adult, and we don't have a lot of them.
Exactly. It's not easy in politics, and it's amazing just what power does to people. As we've just been taught over and over again, money and power, most people are changed by that. And so it becomes hard to find people that really do truly have that backbone to stand up against that. But, like I said, there's a lot of positive things happening within the states, a lot of positive legislation saying, wait a minute, we've got to roll back this power that has been given. And so, we've got to just keep working together and really make that a focus, though, that this should be our number one priority at this time, because there's nobody that's going to be immune from their liberties being restricted if power just keeps continuing to conglomerate. Nobody is going to be able to say, oh, well, that won't affect me. Nobody. And nobody's children are going to be able to be immune from that either.
Yeah.
So if not for us, let's do it for our kids.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, thank you guys for watching. If you want to get involved and do the heavy lifting like Jen has done, you can go to UtahCitizensForTheConstitution.org or .com. And also whyIloveAmerica.org, and you can figure out how you can get involved and make a difference. So thank you so much for watching, and until next time, God bless America.